gaming, alternative platforms. So let's go ahead and get started. There you go. Well, there was much debate about the first video game, mostly over what criteria to use to constitute a video game. The first endeavor that looked like a video game was called Tennis for Two by one of the scientists working on the Manhattan Project, Willie Higginbotham. The game very much looked like the future Pong, but since it was never developed further or manufactured commercially, it is mostly known to technological historians and gaming geeks, but not to the general public. The first video game to find a large audience and be available beyond a single exhibition was Spacewar. It was initially developed by 3 students at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Stephen R. Slug Russell, J. Martin Grates, and Wayne Wittinen. In 1962, Spacewar allowed 2 players to control dueling spaceships and attempt to shoot each other with torpedoes while orbiting a black hole. Spacewar, played using a cathode ray tube display and custom-built controllers on the Digital Equipment Corporation's PDP-1 computer, also featured a score display. This and other competition-oriented features ensured that Spacewar was a hit. Within a year of its 1962 demonstration at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology annual Science Open House in May 1962, copies and variations of the Spacewar program began to emerge at research laboratories across the United States, and the game was being played not only on PDP-1 computers, but on other computers that used a cathode ray tube display as well. And that's what it looked like. How much fun is that? While the actual Spacewar game as originally programmed could not be commercialized because it was played on expensive research computers that were usually inaccessible to the public, the first coin-operated arcade games were both adaptations of Spacewar, Galaxy, a kind of arcade unit that debuted on the Stanford University campus in Palo Alto, California in 1971, and was the first coin-operated video game, and Computer Space, a mass-produced coin-operated arcade game released later the same year throughout the United States. So we have Computer Space and we have Spacewar Galaxy as arcade games. Therefore, whatever early device is credited as the first video game, there's no debating that Spacewar accomplished 2 milestones important to the scalability of the video game as a mass medium. It was the first video game to be played on more than one machine, and the first video game to be adapted for commercialization. 1972 saw the release of the first commercial home video game console, the Magnavox Odyssey, which featured sport and shooting games among its game titles. The Odyssey console used light signals combined with overlays placed on the user's television screens to simulate graphics and featured predominantly sports and action games, though some games featured other simulations such as roulette. The popular Atari Video Computer System, the VCS, later renamed the Atari 2600, as later console versions were developed, was released with a game titled Combat that featured 27 combat games such as tank and biplane duels. Through so much technological advancement over decades, though the video game industry's most popular titles remain heavily fixed in the themes of simulating sport and combat that inspired the first video game prototypes. The top 10 best-selling video games in the United States in 2013 included 2 games from the perennially popular military-themed Call of Duty franchise, Call of Duty Ghosts and Call of Duty Black Ops II, as well as Battlefield 4, another entry from a popular military-themed series. 2 more video games, chart-topping Grand Theft Auto V and Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, included combat simulation as the heavy component of their themes. Madden NFL 25 and NBA 2K14 represented annual releases from sporting franchises. The annual entry from the popular FIFA video game series, a notable omission from the United States list, given its popularity in much of the rest of the world, with Just Dance 2014 arguably something of a sporting simulation as well. On the top 10 sellers in the United States, then, only the console edition of Minecraft and Disney Infinity were not primarily action simulations of war, combat, or sport. In 1978, two British computer science students at the University of Essex named Roy Trubshaw and Richard Bartle finished the first functioning version of a very different kind of game that they would continue to refine and develop through the two more versions through 1980. While even the term video game indicates the importance of rich graphical representations to most examples of the medium, Trubshaw and Bartle's game had no graphics at all. Their game, MUD, Multi-User Dungeon, instead relied on interactive text commands and automatically generated text feedback for all the players' interactions with the game program, as well as between players using the game at the same time. To play MUD, users connected to the game online by creating and logging into character accounts with names and statistics described attributes such as stamina. Using these characters, which existed in the game solely as text descriptions, like all the games of other. I'm sorry, I've got a cat that won't leave me alone. There we go. To play MUD, users connected to the game online by creating and logging into character accounts with names and statistics describing attributes such as stamina. Using these characters, which existed in the game solely as text descriptions like all of the game's other elements, players then navigated a vast game environment by typing commands to travel from location to location, interact with objects and features of the environment, talk to other players, and fight with both other players and computer-controlled characters. The game's program responded to the commands with text feedback such as descriptions of places, characters, and objects, as well as feedback describing the results of attempts to carry out actions such as picking up an object or attacking a foe. Aside from indulging in these game dynamics, players could also have conversations with each other via text, either privately or in view of other players. An inspiration for Zork and Colossal Cave adventure was the paper and pencil dice-based tabletop role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons in 1974. Created as a partial adaptation of existing strategy war games, but with players controlling individual characters instead of military units, Dungeons & Dragons was the first commercial role-playing game and has remained a dominant fixture in the genre since. The popularity of Dungeons & Dragons themes and mechanics in MUD games was perhaps predictable, considering that Dungeons & Dragons players were using online networks as a rudimentary communication tool to facilitate playing their tabletop games across distance even before MUD was created. A key source of thematic inspiration for Dungeons & Dragons was the famed work of J.R.R. Tolkien, a British professor at Oxford University who produced influential scholarship on topics such as the Old English epic poem Beowulf, and who achieved much popular fame by penning best-selling fantasy novels such as The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien's work, a popular culture staple by the 1970s, had a heavy imprint on the themes of Dungeons & Dragons, as it is best evidenced by inclusion of several fantastic creature species, including Tolkien's iconic hobbits from Tolkien's story in the original version of the game. Habitat, released online in 1986, allowed players to interact with each other in the environment via text commands and also represented characters, objects, and settings with simple graphics. Rather than a fantastic setting, the Habitat game environment included much more mundane elements such as apartments and bank machines. The graphics of Habitat were mostly static, and the gameplay and interaction between users was mostly driven by text commands and text chat. In 1991, Neverwinter Nights brought more dynamic graphics that portrayed movement each time a player moved the character avatar with a keyboard arrow key. The game was successful with a peak subscriber total of more than 100,000 by 1997, and its graphical advancements have earned its retrospective recognition as the first graphical version of the massively multiplayer online role-playing game genre. Given the catch-all nature of the term video game, clear articulations of the medium's economic impact and audience are elusive given the diversity in the range of technologies, forms, and themes described as video games as mirrored by the diversity in their range of business models and users. Some current estimates of the total revenue of the worldwide video game market are in the neighborhood of $81.5 billion to $93 billion US, with continued growth predicted in the coming years. The first video game subjected to moral panic was the 1976 driving simulator Death Race, an arcade machine in which players sitting at the controls of a physical steering wheel and gas pedal earned points by using their on-screen car as a weapon to run over gremlins. The game sparked controversy for essentially encouraging players to use their cars in an aggressive manner, awarding them points for committing vehicular homicide, reminiscent of the 1975 film Death Race 2000. Researchers proclaim that while television violence is passive, in Death Race, a player takes the first step to creating violence. The player is no longer just a spectator, he's an actor in the process. The most prominent illustration of the limits of what public would be willing to accept in a violent video game can be found in the 1992 release of the arcade fighter Mortal Kombat. Mortal Kombat broke an implicit taboo about what was okay to put in a video game, such as the game's use of motion capture technology to display realistic human body movement, the intense focus on blood and gore during in-game fights, and the not-so-secret fatality special moves where players could brutally kill each other through a series of beatings, beheadings, and disembowelments, based on the talents of the gamer as well as their in-game character. Although the game's reputation in arcades had drawn some criticism from activist groups, it was the game's home release on September 20th, 1993, or Mortal Monday, as labeled in a $10 million advertising campaign by producer Acclaim, at the time the largest advertising campaign ever for a video game that was most concerning for a critical public. Prior to release, Nintendo censored out the blood and violence and altered the fatality moves to make them less graphic in their Super Nintendo version of the game. While not editing the original game code, except to make it compatible with their system, Sega chose instead to label the game packaging with a MA13 as not appropriate for children under the age of 13. However, in the face of intensifying congressional scrutiny to answer questions about whether or not games were training killers and encouraging graphic violence, the two companies instead chose to debate each other's relative moral stance. Complicating these debates was a complete lack of any scientific data on the potential impact of video games on aggression, leaving all sides of the argument with little more than empty rhetoric on which to base their claims. In the face of mounting public, governmental, and industry pressure to address the moral panic caused by Mortal Kombat, 1994 saw the creation of the Entertainment Software Rating Boards, an independent organization funded by the gaming industry and designed to empower consumers, especially parents, with guidance that allows them to make informed decisions about the age appropriateness and suitability of video games. Mortal Kombat was the first game ever assigned ESRB's M rating for mature audiences only, and you can see it right here. On the Mortal Kombat Aftermath game, whatever, console, I don't know what it is. M for mature. An established rating system did little to quell moral panics related to video game violence, and as a series of high-profile school shootings in the United States reignited concerns that video games served as interactive murder simulations, investigations into the causes of tragic incidents in Paducah, Kentucky, December 1st, 1997, and Columbine, Colorado, April 20th, 1999, by politicians implicated video games as a root cause. Columbine is actually in Aurora, Colorado. Columbine is a school. On the surface, linking violent video games to school shootings was a simple matter of observational deduction, given the increased popularity of the first-person shooting game in the 1990s. Games such as Wolfenstein 3D in 1992 and Doom in 1993 ushered in a genre of video games in which the player was effectively placed in the shoes of the main protagonist, a Nazi prisoner in the former and a space marine in the latter. Armed with high-powered weapons and challenged with navigating a series of mazes and puzzles while being attacked on all sides by enemy soldiers and demons. As games gained in popularity, the content of games became increasingly scandalous, such as the most commercially and critically successful games in the medium's history with Grand Theft Auto. The 2001 release of Grand Theft Auto 3 popularized the sandbox genre of video games in which the player has the ability to navigate the environment as if it were real. In this game, players adopt the role of a criminal involved in any number of organized crime activities, from car theft to drug running to prostitution and murder. The content is decidedly dark, from the theft of vehicles to get from one mission to the next, to the murder of rival crime bosses, police officers, and innocent bystanders who might interfere with the player's objectives. There were widespread fears that gamers would be a generation of fatties who never left the house, stereotyping a social interactiveness and awkwardness of gamers. A case in point, James Dallas Egbert III, a Michigan State University student, went missing in August of 1979. Early fears about Egbert's disappearance centered around the fascination with the role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons, or also known as D&D. Many early media reports suggested that he had taken refuge in steam tunnels below the school to reenact scenarios from the game. It was later discovered that Egbert suffered from severe depression and had entered the steam tunnels in an attempt to commit suicide in seclusion. Following the Egbert story, scores of panics regarded D&D players as malcontents incapable of discerning fantasy and reality, led to similar allegations in the United States and the UK. With the advance of newer interactive technologies, the popularity of video games, especially among children, has reignited debates as to the role that mediated fantasies of death and destruction play in the shaping of future generations. The current empirical record is by no means invalid, but rather in need of further refinement of research designed to better describe, explain, predict, and eventually control the results of the interaction between mediated content and human interactions with that content. Doing so requires us to better understand our research heritage to seek areas of replication and extension. The legacy of fear of media effects is just that, a fear rooted not in science, but all too often in the moral panics of well-meaning researchers less committed to understanding a phenomenon and more committed to stopping it before it is fully understood. Children and teens seem to use video games to meet a wide range of emotional and developmental needs. For example, Managing Feelings, a survey of 1,254 middle schoolers in 2 states, found that many children use video games for emotional regulation, as an antidote to boredom and loneliness, to relax and to vent angry feelings. This response from focus groups with a 13-year-old boy was typical. If I had a bad day at school, I'll play a violent video game and it just relieves all my stress. Trying on new identities. Many video games, especially online multiplayer games, allow players to safely experiment with new roles and identities. It's perfectly acceptable to play as a character of another age, gender, body shape, or species. Players can test how it feels to not only look different, but to take on a different personality or a new role on a team and see how others react when they do. I was looking at my grandson's Fortnite. He's got like 15 different characters, and about 4 or 5 of them are female, which seems a little odd. The oddest part is, why in the world do all the females wear such short skirts? That seems a little odd. They're in cheerleading outfits or something. Leadership and teamwork. Researchers have surveyed tens of thousands of people who play MMOGs, massively multiplayer online games such as EverQuest and World of Warcraft, about their motivations and experiences with gaming. Online play in mixed age teams, where no one knows how old or young you are, offers unique opportunities for teens and young adults to observe, learn, and practice leading groups towards shared goals. Online leadership experience has been linked to managing others in offline settings, such as voluntary organizations. Several studies suggest that team video game play encourages real-life helpful behavior. A study of British undergraduate students found that frequent players of computer games were more likely to cooperate for a win-win outcome with other players in Prisoner's Dilemma experiments. Competition and initiative. In response to a series of questions about why they play video games, more than 4 in 5 middle school boys and almost 2/3 of girls agreed with the statement, "I'd like to compete with others and win." The challenge and excitement of testing strategies against opponents may promote initiative and healthy youth development. However, there is an ongoing vigorous debate about whether aggressive competition in games with violent content might undermine empathy or promote harmful behaviors. Curiosity, self-expression, and testing limits. Video games allow children to escape real-world limitations and let their creativity soar. Boys in focus groups noted that over-the-top gory games are fun because I just love the fact that I know it can't happen. In a real world, there's limitations to what you can do. Games that allow modding, from customizing characters to designing buildings, maps, and more, let players express themselves in ways that would be costly and difficult in real life, and sometimes to share those mods with others. Players can also test theories or approaches, fail, and try again without real consequences, like riding a motorcycle if you're a giraffe. Practice setting goals and coping with frustration. In 1970s, Walter Mischel, that's Walter on the right, began a series of experiments with preschoolers on delay of gratification. They were given the choice to eat a marshmallow now or wait, usually 15 minutes, until the experimenter came back from an errand and get 2 marshmallows. It turned out to be a wonderful way to measure frustration tolerance and the ability to wait for a payoff. In longitudinal studies, researchers found that those children who learned ways to distract themselves and earn the second marshmallow had a wide range of advantages over their marshmallow gobbling peers. They proved better at planning and thinking ahead. They were more verbally fluent, resourceful, and attentive. They were less rattled under stress, and they were more socially outgoing. These gains persisted into adolescence. Seconds of marshmallow resistance time even statistically predicted higher SAT scores by about 120 points, actually. I just read that yesterday. Children with attention deficit disorder, ADD, both with and without hyperactivity, often struggle to stay focused and pay attention and are easily distracted except when it comes to video games. Parents and teachers comment that children with attention problems seem to have no problem concentrating on a video game for long periods. Given the fast pace of mini games, some have wondered if video games might aggravate attention problems. Some studies have linked greater time spent with video games as well as television to increased risk of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD symptoms. There's also evidence that pathological gaming, defined as persistent trouble controlling gameplay habits despite bad consequences, is more common among young people who show signs of ADHD. One study found that teens with attention problems were more likely to go on to develop unhealthy gaming habits. I want to show you something. Wait a second. Expand this. This lady's got a bunion on her toe. Look at that. Look how big that is. Why in the world is she not wearing shoes? Why are they barefoot? Why is she showing off her bunion? Anyway, I just thought you might be interested, fascinated, as I was when I first saw it. Wait a minute. Lady's got a bunion. That's what a bunion looks like. Yes, she does have a bunion. Children with ADHD tend to have problems with executive functions such as working memory and response inhibition that allow children to focus on why does she have a bunion? She probably wears shoes that are too small. And they rub the inside of her feet. She's got kind of wide feet anyway. Oh, she had another problem. Wait a second. One of her toes crosses over, doesn't it? Yeah. Yeah, that's weird. Look at that. See? She wears shoes that are too small, so her second toe has lifted up to give her and look at her little toe. Wait a minute. That's not her little toe. That's the side of her foot. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, that's the side of her foot. My goodness, that poor thing. She wears the wrong shoes. You can see what's happened with her toe. Her toe is above the others. Her second toe. Isn't that weird? Anyway. Okay, we're looking at people's feet here. And that's actually a fairly common problem with women that wear high heels. The high heels that people are wearing now are called pizza toe shoes, and they're really narrow. And that's what it does to your feet, because your feet aren't shaped that way. Your feet are shaped like a fan. And you can see her little toe was scrunched up the side of her foot. She's just got a wide foot. She shouldn't be wearing shoes like that. Anyway. Okay. Children with ADHD tend to have problems with executive functions such as working memory and response inhibition that allow children to focus on what the teacher is saying, wait for their turn to talk, and keep track of assignments. A study comparing children with and without ADHD found that the first group did worse on a standard computer-based test of attention and inhibition, involving clicking on a series of alphabet letters. However, both groups did equally well on PlayStation iToy games that tapped similar skills. This supports other research suggesting that children with ADHD do better with novel, stimulating tasks that offer immediate rewards, such as video games, as many video games do. And this is actually PlayStation iToy. They're having a race. And I think she's ahead. No, maybe she's ahead. I don't know. Whoops. Okay, researchers compared a standard computer-based working memory training program for children with ADHD to a program that added game elements, including a story, animation, and rewards. Children who trained with the game version stuck with training longer, improved faster, and made fewer mistakes. Other studies which assigned children and adults to play action video games found that the gameplay improved sustained attention and reduced impulsivity. Despite these promising findings, researchers caution that it's too soon to add video games to ADHD treatment plans. Results of studies on normal populations may not translate to people with attention problems whose brains work a bit differently, because you can't get their attention. Compared to attention problems, there are fewer studies looking at what video games might contribute to depression. In a large study of urban fifth graders, heavy play of violent video games, 2 hours plus per day, was associated with a higher number of depressive symptoms. In a study of Norwegian teens, scoring high on a measure of video game addiction was linked to depression, but time spent on games was not. Similarly, young teens who self-report symptoms of depression don't spend more time playing video games or violent games compared to their peers, but they are more likely to play to cope with feelings and forget problems. So they're using video games as a coping technique. They're using video games as self-medication. A recent study of nearly 5,000 young British teens found that those who kept video game play in balance with other activities, with less than 1/3 of daily free time devoted to gaming, scored higher on emotional and social well-being compared to non-gamers. However, children who spent more than half of their daily free time with video games had more emotional and behavioral problems, as well as lower life satisfaction. Recent evidence suggests that more than half of Americans play games and have at least one gaming console in their homes. Among children, the numbers are even higher, with almost all boys playing video games and a smaller majority of girls playing as well. Women are almost as likely to play video games as men, and adults are as likely to play as children and adolescents. 1/3 of American parents play video games with their children at least once a week, and just over half believe that games are a positive part of their children's lives. Games and gamers are ubiquitous. People play alone and together, at home and on the move. All this time spent gaming has largely been at the expense of time previously spent consuming other kinds of media, in particular TV and movies. Nonetheless, people have often worried that gaming has caused serious problems for social interaction and physical activity and health. However, data from gamers themselves question whether such stereotypes apply to the majority of gamers. The socially isolated, physically inactive teenage gamer certainly exists, but she or he is an endangered species. There is a lot of evidence that the young of many species play with each other and spend a lot of time engaging in generally fairly rough and tumble activities, which seem to serve no obvious purpose. No obvious purpose, perhaps, until we start asking questions about what is being learned during all this play. Barbara Fredrickson argues that when we play, we are actually experimenting with new ways of solving problems in a safe environment which permits creative experimentation and does not penalize failure. Penalize failure. This is one of those escape rooms, I think. Yeah, escape game. From the Mall of America in Bloomington, Minnesota. Experimenting with new ways of escaping from a real predator is not a sensible thing to do. In contrast, experimenting with different ways of running away, dodging, and hiding with your brothers and sisters might broaden the range of options you have and build physical and psychological resources that could help you survive when the predator is a real one. Fredrickson's broaden and build theory suggests that play lies at the heart of learning, and those individuals who play stand a greater chance of survival than those who don't, precisely because they have greater flexibility in the behavioral responses available to them. Wow, what great hiders. Even seemingly pointless activities such as tickling may actually serve an important function. Donald Black observed that places where we are most ticklish, the neck, the sides of the body, the exposed soles of the feet, are also those which we might need to protect in an emergency. Tickling motivates us to escape while simultaneously making us laugh. It simulates an emergency situation in that we need to protect vital areas of our bodies from being attacked by an opponent who is not going to give up. Play and fun are inextricably tied up with survival. Like soldiers on the firing range, young organisms engage in safe but violent facsimiles of real-world fight or flight, life or death situations. So long as everyone knows it is a game with punches stopping short and teeth nibbling rather than biting, everyone benefits from the activity. Games can also be understood as meeting basic psychological needs. Video games can help us to meet basic psychological needs that are not always met through real-life activities, particular needs for socializations, competence, and autonomy. One can inhabit the fictional universe of a video game in which, along with friends, one can seem to have a real and meaningful impact on the game world through one's own actions. This can be powerfully motivating. Konrad Lorenz reminds us that aggression is a drive, a naturally occurring behavior which helps organisms get what they need. While aggressive behavior may not be appropriate in many situations which face modern humans, and aggressive behavior certainly is an important issue facing society, we should not fall into the trap of believing aggressive responses are never appropriate. Aggression motivates us to acquire what we need and achieve our goals, and help defend what we have from others who aggress against us. An individual who lacked aggressive behaviors on which to draw in times of need would not pass its genes on to the next generation. There is a natural component to aggression, and aggressive behavior is not necessarily a negative thing, although it may be if overused or used maladaptively. What are the effects of repeated experiences of aggression or repeated exposure to the aggression of others? There are two main responses to this question. Theories which focus on desensitizing effects of the violence and exposure to violence state that repeated exposure to violence reduces its emotional impact and makes violent acts normal. If we live in an environment where, rightly or wrongly, we perceive violence to be normal, then there is nothing wrong with behaving violently ourselves. In this account, exposure to the violent video games desensitizes people to violence, making them more likely to be violent in the future. Theories which emphasize catharsis view aggression and violence in much the same way as Lorenz, as drives which need to be discharged. The principle of catharsis is seen as a form of purging or purifying innate emotions and tensions, leaving us in a state of balance. Under these ideas, viewing violent games, play, VVG, I forgot what VVG was. Violent video games, Violent video game play represents a psychologically healthy activity, and indeed we might predict that it would lead to a reduction rather than an increase in real-life violence. Hi-ya! Different researchers choose different measures of aggression, and these relate with differing degrees of effectiveness to the sorts of real-life behavior we are interested in. Sometimes the measure of aggression is not chosen by the researcher at all, but is simply already available. If we believe there to be a link between violent video game playing and violence, we might conclude that as the availability of violent video games increases, the amount of violent crimes also increases. Our hypothesis might lead us to predict a strong association between the two. As violent video game availability increases, so does violent crime. Patrick and Charlotte Markey in 2010 argued that no one personality dimension makes a person vulnerable, but that certain levels in 3 of the big 5 dimensions, open to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and eroticism, those are the big 5, when present in the same individual might be critical. Their conclusion is that people who score low on conscientiousness, low on agreeableness, and high on neuroticism may possess a pre-existing disposition to be negatively affected by violent video games. Such people tend to be fairly unconcerned about the feelings of others, are likely to break rules and not worry about convention, and experience strong emotional reactions to events. When exposed to violence or frustration, people who have this vulnerable personality may respond strongly and without concern for social rules or the feelings of others. There is a gene that affects the levels of an enzyme, monoamine oxidase A, which is responsible for the breaking down of some of the chemicals affecting transmission of information in the brain. About a third of the population has a version of MAOA gene, which means that they produce lower levels of the enzyme. Such people are indistinguishable from those who produce normal levels of the enzyme, except when certain environmental conditions hold. Research examined the effects of MAOA levels and childhood maltreatment on violent criminal behavior. Neither MAOA level nor a history of childhood maltreatment had an effect in isolation, but in combination, the two accounted for a significant proportion of violent crime. Childhood maltreatment and violent criminal behavior. There is a fairly clear and increasingly evidence that violent video games do not cause aggression, but may interact with biological and psychological characteristics of the individual people, making some more vulnerable to individuals more likely to respond aggressively than others. And what has just recently happened? There was a shooting last night in Lewiston, Maine, where 18 people were killed. It looks like, and they haven't stated this yet, but the guy went into a bowling alley where there was a junior bowling league that was taking place. These kids were kids. They were teenagers. So we'll see what transpired. Why am I talking about this? Oh, we're talking about the biological and psychological characters of individual people. And that is the end of the lecture. So let me turn this on.